You are now listening to EdYOUcate, the most fired up educational podcast there is. EdYOUcate is all about the quality education access to students and how we can provide research-based solutions to free the young minds of the world. On this podcast, we will be exploring different educational experiences, education's greatest of debates, and more. The hottest educational podcast out. EdYOUcate is brought to you from the Albany State University's very own Center for Educational Opportunity. Enjoy.
In this episode, we will be talking about school choice and school boards. We have a special guest here today, Robert Maranto. If you would like to just introduce yourself to the listeners and just give them more background information about who you are and what you do.
Hi, thanks so much, Jamila. It's great to be here. I'll try to speak clearly because I know the podcasts sometimes garble things a little bit, especially on my end. I'm the 21st century chair in leadership in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. And that's a fancy way of saying that I'm a political scientist who studies schools, especially school leadership. I'm actually on a charter board, a cyber charter. I've spent 5 years on the board of my local district schools. So I've seen things from different angles. I was in government for a little bit during the Clinton years. So I've been around a bit. I always tell people it's very good to actually serve some time in government or in schools or in whatever to get a better sense of what's really going on. And I edit a journal called the Journal of School Choice. So I've studied bureaucracies generally since the 80s and schools in particular since maybe the late 90s, mostly comparing charter schools and district schools, but have also done things on school boards, on school leadership, a fair amount on higher education. And you know, it's just a fun job. I'll also briefly tout my department. The Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas is just a fun place to be. We have great faculty. We have outstanding graduate students. And in fact, our top graduate stipends, it's hard to get in, but if you get in, we pay students up to $37,000 a year plus tuition just to get a PhD. All of our students get nice jobs. So it's a fun place to be. People are always discussing ideas. And we do a lot of quantitative work, but most of us also spend a lot of time in schools. I think you really need to do both to get a good understanding of what's going on out there. But that's an overly long introduction. And I think Kathaleena is doing some very interesting things at Albany State. And I and others have said we're glad to help out any time. I think she has some great ideas.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I just wanted to know, could you tell me a little bit more about school boards and just some background information that you know from being so involved in that area in which you specialize in school boards?
Well, this is kind of funny. If you were to ask me like 6 or 7 years back what I know about school boards, it would be very little. They don't work very well, but other than that, not very much. And about 6 years ago, our favorite school board member had announced that she was not going to run for re-election. And so my wife and I sat down with her for a couple hours to try to convince her, a local banker, a very smart person, very dedicated person. We were trying to convince her to run for re-election, and in the end, she convinced me to run. But she also said, there's somebody already running who's sort of supposed to win. He's the anointed choice. You should meet him and see if you can work with him, and if not, you should run. And she said, if not, I'll help you run. And she really kind of wanted us to run. And asked my wife first. She said no. Then she asked me, and I said, well, maybe. And so we ran, and I had this image. And part of the reason why I ran was school boards mostly in big cities, it's very different where things are often quite unpredictable. But in small towns, mostly school, and mine is a medium-sized town. We have about 10,000 kids in local schools, local public schools. Mostly school board members sort of take orders from the superintendent. So the most important decision you make really is who is the superintendent. And then once you've done that, the superintendent, if they're pretty good, is probably working 60 hours a week. School board members generally aren't paid. They're working maybe 5 hours a week. So, and they also really, a lot of times, don't know what they're doing. I certainly did not have a good understanding of the school budget. I had understanding of some other things. I'm not really sure any of us did. It's a $120 million budget. And we're part-time officials, right? So how much are we going to know? So really, the big decision you make is who's going to be superintendent. And at the time, we had an interim superintendent. And I thought, oh, this is great. If I win, if I lose, that's okay. If I win, I'll have one of the 7 votes on who the next superintendent is. And one of the things about school boards in Arkansas, and this varies a lot from state to state, But in most Arkansas districts, the informal rule is that for a very big decision like choosing a superintendent, first off, the decisions are made pretty much behind the scenes. And second off, because we hate controversy. If you have controversy, businesses might think you're a bad town to go locate in, and it looks bad, and people criticize each other. So almost all the politicking is done behind the scenes. Even though legally that's not supposed to happen, that's sort of how it does happen at the vast majority of places. But the other thing is we really like consensus decision making. We like it where everybody agrees and there's no controversy. And so I thought, wow, if I'm a member of the school board and I'm just willing to say I'm not going to vote for that superintendent, I may be able to veto who the next superintendent is and have a lot of power. Because if you care more about getting something done than whether people like you, you actually can have a lot of power on a board. And so this is great. So if I win, I'll have a disproportionate impact over who the next superintendent will be. And something that my wife and I and some others didn't like is that certainly our prior superintendent did not prioritize academics, didn't prioritize either closing achievement gaps or challenging the kids who started out sort of advanced. And there are a lot of stories I can tell about that, but I'll leave those for the book. But I would just say she did not prioritize those things. And I really wanted a superintendent who would. And so then I got elected. It was an upset, and we won in a landslide with twice the usual turnout. And so let me ask you, what do you think twice the usual turnout was? The presidential race, you might get 70% turnout in our town. What was the turnout for the school board race?
Okay, so twice multiplied 70% by 2 times?
No. That's for presidency. Everybody votes for president, right? It's really high profile. Everybody knows Trump and Biden or Trump and Clinton. School board elections are in most states, they're pretty low priority. They're pretty low key. And Arkansas, we've made it even a little worse because until quite recently, until actually this election last year, where I lost, by the way, I lost running for re-election. Until last year, school boards could set when their election dates were. We would pick the most obscure dates there are. We would do that so turnout would be very low. So my election had twice the usual turnout, 6%. There were about 11,000 eligible voters, I think around 650 or so. Around 620 turned out to vote. I got almost 2/3 of those in a 3-way race. So 6% turnout was considered high turnout. Now we have elections during regular primary elections and turnout's a lot higher, but still way lower than usual. So you get a small number of people voting, which is one of the problems a lot of times. So anyway, so I got elected and I thought, well, this is great. I'll use this to make sure we get an academically oriented superintendent. And the thing that I learned that was kind of a surprise to me and shouldn't have been, because I had been doing field work in schools for almost 20 years at this point, was that very few school superintendents or deputy superintendents and very few school boards prioritize academic learning. The general view is that, well, some kids will learn and some won't, and there's not a lot schools can do about it. And so over the years, when I've had conversations with people and I say, this charter school over here is doing a really good job closing achievement gaps. Let's visit it and see what they do. Or not even charters. We have a district school system 20 miles north of us, Rogers. It does great work closing achievement gaps between sort of wealthy Anglo kids and Hispanic immigrant kids. And we've never visited them. We've never seen, I have, but as a district, we've never visited to see how they do it. People say, well, those kids are different. Well, I've been there. The kids, they kind of seem a lot like our kids. The statistics indicate they're kind of a lot like our kids. Most districts, both school boards and superintendents, they don't really see schools as being able to move the needle much on student achievement. They also don't really value student achievement that much. And that sort of makes sense to me if you study the history of both school boards and school superintendents. So back more than 100 years ago, the National Education Association, which we nowadays is a teachers union, but nobody knows the history of this. In the old days, the NEA was actually a school administrators association, and it had a lot of clout, in some ways more clout than it does today. In 1918, they issued the cardinal principles of secondary education. They said, what's secondary education supposed to be all about? And it wasn't learning. It was mostly social stuff. It was preparing people for the workplace. It was preparing them to get along with others. There was only one of the 7 cardinal principles was really linked to academic study. And, when I talk to to people, professors in ed schools, when I talk to school superintendents, when I talk to school board members, they're not that into the academic learning part of it. They're into the social part of it. They're into buildings. They're into strategic planning for buildings. They're into good publicity. They're not that into the academic part of it. And I would even go so far as to say, not intentionally. I think they're really good people. I have rarely met a school board person or a superintendent who I didn't think of as a good human being who didn't want to serve kids. But they don't see the role of schools to change the needle on academics very much. But they also, if you talk to them about their own schooling, academics isn't what they talk about. They talk about school activities, they talk about dances, they talk about athletic events a lot. More than half of American male principals, not in Arkansas, but nationally, more than half of principals were former coaches, former athletic coaches, of male principals were former athletic coaches. If you look at superintendents, the superintendency is still mostly male. Last I checked, about 70% of superintendents were male. And we have no recent data on this. But our data going back to the 70s was that almost 80% of them were former coaches. And if you look at, and again, I was on the school board for 5 years in a pretty academically oriented town, a college town. The school events we would attend would mostly be athletic events. Football games, basketball games, things like that. Those are the big deal. I don't ever, no, one exception I can think of, I can almost never recall us attending academic events. And literally when I was a school board member, I never watched any classroom teachers. And in fairness to the district, I think I only asked once or twice. But I have a lot of friends who are classroom teachers, who are very good teachers. And probably if I'd asked them, it would have been okay. But it's just not something school board members do. And if you look at, for 4 years, I went to school board member training. It was never about how to hire and retain good teachers. There was a lot of emphasis on teamwork. There was a lot of emphasis on, here again and again, you shouldn't run for school board for some or another cause. As a friend of mine put it, well, why didn't I run? Why did I run? If I didn't run for some or another cause, why should I run, right? What's the point? I ran mostly on two planks: hire and retain really great teachers. In some cases, fire those that aren't working out. And also be more open to parents, concerns, which are not always great about. And there wasn't much support for that. And I think a lot of it was people who run for school board, people who serve as school administrators, they're not reformers. And we reformers have our own issues, right? A lot of times we're overly negative. A lot of times we're too reluctant to admit the strengths of the system. I realized pretty quickly when I was, I've had kids in the school, in this or another school district since, I guess 2004. And I remember 2005. And I remember when I was first in my son's kindergarten, I was a volunteer parent. And I immediately realized that I could not keep order during lunchtime and recess. And the teachers and teachers' aides could, right? Something you learn really quick is, think, I'm a PhD. I've done a lot of work in schools. I know a lot of stuff. And something you realize really quickly is people who actually run schools know some things, right? They're not idiots. A good principal in particular will know a lot of stuff. I had the first school my kids were at, the principal was amazing. She was one of the best leaders I've ever received. But overall, principals and superintendents, school board members, they don't prioritize academics. They prioritize getting along. They prioritize having things run in an orderly fashion. They prioritize buses. They prioritize feeding kids. They definitely prioritize athletics. A lot of districts, the most powerful person will be the football coach, right? And if the football coach says you have to hire so-and-so, even though maybe they don't know the subject they're teaching, but they're the assistant linebacker coach, you have to hire them, right? So
and they'll put them where they need to go. They'll put them in any subject where they need to go.
It's a huge thing, and it bonds a lot of school districts together, right? I get that. But it's not going to improve academics, and it's in particular not going to close achievement gaps. And I think we reformers a lot of times are too negative, and we're too quick to judge people from the outside without knowing the inside and knowing their stories. But I also think people in the system are too complacent. They're too quick to say the system's great, and they don't realize there's a lot of kids that the system just aren't serving. I mean, disproportionately students of color. But kids like me, I was a working class white kid, but I read a lot, and I was usually a couple years ahead in terms of certainly my reading, but a lot of times my math too. And the schools didn't really know what to do with me. And I was just bored out of my mind. And I got in trouble a little bit. I had pretty bad grades, actually. I only got into college because I had good SAT scores. They don't know how to handle that. I would say really 40 to 45% of kids who just don't fit the mold. Kids who are a couple years ahead when, given their class background, maybe they shouldn't be. I'm fond of saying I'm a first generation high school attendee, which is true on my mom's side. On my dad's side, I'm a first generation college attendee. But also kids that, like if you read Hillbilly Elegy, it's more common in African American communities, but it's very common among whites too. You have kids like J.D. Vance wrote Hillbilly Elegy, as I recall, had 5 dads at different points in his life. If you've got 5 dads at different points in your life, you need a lot of stability in your life, right? You need stability in your school system. You need the same language in terms of discipline and everything else, from kindergarten to first grade to second grade to third grade. Ideally, you need some of the same people involved in your life. Charter schools do a lot better with disadvantaged kids. And I think a lot of it is a charter school usually will have the same rules from grade to grade. But I think we in district schools, we can copy a lot of that stuff. We can have the same disciplinary rules from grade to grade instead of them changing all the time, which boys in particular have a lot of trouble with. We could have, why don't we do looping? What I see a lot of times in schools now, some of the better charters have overcome this. Harmony schools in Texas, for example, have some ways around this. But in general, you get a teacher you don't gel with, and maybe your mom doesn't like him or her, right? You say, I'm going to wait it out. I hate this teacher. I'm going to wait it out. And the teacher similarly looks at you that way and says, I'm going to wait it out. Who are teachers? Elementary school teachers. They're mostly white girls who love school, right? Who are our students? They're not mostly white. They're about half and half. They're kind of everything. And half of them are boys. They're not girls, right? Or half of them aren't girls. Only a minority of our elementary school kids are white girls who like school, right? And this isn't a knock on white girls who like school. I mean, my wife was one, my mother-in-law was one, right? But they have trouble. They have trouble a lot of times serving those other kids. And so my answer to that is, why don't we do looping? If you have the same, now what people tend to do, both teachers and kids and moms, usually moms are more involved in schooling than dads are, they give up on the relationship. They say, I don't like this teacher. And they just kind of give up on it. And the teacher says, I don't like that kid. And they just kind of give up on it. I say, all right, what if you had that teacher or kid for 2 or 3 years? What if you did looping from year to year? You would have more incentives to try to build the relationship. And some of the more effective charter schools I've seen try to do mechanisms like that. Something they also do, the charter schools that do a better job closing achievement gaps, or at least some of the ones I've studied. I've actually never seen a quantitative study of this. This is stuff I picked up just visiting a couple hundred schools over the years. And some school districts do this too. Some school districts here and there have copied it. So you start out the first days of school, right? Everybody's kind of getting to know each other. And if the teacher is good, they'll lay out the rules. There's a very good book on that called The First Days of School by Wong and Wong. And I've had a lot of teachers. Whenever I do field work in a school, if I'm talking to a teacher who seems pretty good, or the principal tells me he's pretty good, I say, all right, what's the one thing a new teacher should read? Very often, they will say Wong and Wong, I can't remember their first names. It's a husband and wife couple. Their book, The First Days of School. And they say the first days of school, the first week, 10 days, sometimes 2 weeks, you're just laying out the rules. You're saying this is how the classroom works, and you're maintaining order. And they say, if you don't have order in September, guess what? You're not going to have it in May. And if kids don't know what the rules are, they're not going to follow them. So my kid would, really bad teacher he had once, who would say things like, class, don't we all want to go color now? And my son would go, no, I don't want to color, right? A lot of teachers, a lot of kids, boys in particular, need explicit rules. It's like, we're going to do this from 10 to 11. We're going to do this from 11 to 12. It just works out better that way. If you'd given him explicit rules, he wouldn't have gotten in trouble, right? We need a lot of times explicit rules. Boys in particular, girls are better at picking up on, I think she wants me to do this and doing it. Boys aren't as good at that. And working class kids like me aren't as good at it as upper class kids. Lisa Delpit's written about that, from the left, E.D. Hirsch has written about it from the right. A lot of people have written on this. So that's something you can do to help close this achievement gaps. When you have order, people can learn more. But here's another thing you can do. Even if you don't do looping, you got the same teacher from year to year. What if you do this? Or what if you do home visits? And a lot of the schools I've seen that do pretty well at closing achievement gaps, most KIPP campuses did something like this. Harmony schools in Texas did this. Lisa schools in Arkansas do this. So the first, either a week or two before school, there's a school district in Kentucky, and my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it, where the superintendent's on this for 5 years now. So the 2 weeks before school, or the first 2 weeks of school, you have the teacher try to visit the home of each of their kids. And some moms don't want you visiting their home, understandably. So you take them out for coffee at McDonald's or something like that. You visit somewhere in a neutral setting, right? Neutral or positive to them. And it's not a nasty meeting. It's not doing paperwork. It's just saying, hi, I'm teacher so-and-so. This is what I like to do. This is how I like the year to run. So what's Johnny like? Can you tell me about him? What is he like? What's his favorite TV show or his favorite Pokemon or whatever? And maybe even bring a little present or something. And you make it a super positive visit. What's he like to do? Why is that important? If your first interaction with somebody, first off, if you don't know them very well or know them at all, and second off, if your first interaction is negative, Johnny's not doing his homework, Johnny hit Susie today, whatever. As a mom or dad, your natural reaction is going to tend to be negative. Lady, who are you telling me this? And a lot of times people themselves, I was one of them, did not have a good experience in school. So they're kind of bigoted against school to start with. And then you start out, and the first thing you do is you're somebody with more status than they have and a college degree, and you're telling them how their kids screwed up. That's not going to be a positive interaction, and they're going to tend to take the kid's side and not your side. So say, what if over coffee you get to know each other as human beings and you communicate that you really care about Johnny and you want it to be a good year and you want Johnny to succeed, and anything that they can tell you to help that relationship work is good. And here's what they need to know about your classroom. And then if 2 weeks later you have to call up and say, Miss So-and-so, I hate to say this, I really like Johnny, but, and I remember so-and-so's his favorite Pokemon or whatever, but, he hit Susie today. Here's what I'm doing as punishment. And at home, it would just be really helpful if you had to talk with them and just said, we can't have this and here's why. And if it happens again, we'll have to do so. And so that's a potentially positive thing. Now, am I going to tell you that 100% of parents are going to react to it positively? No, but most of them will. Parents, mostly they want their kids to do well. And if you can, as an educator, team up with the parents and work together with them, it's much more likely to be a positive relationship, and you're much more likely to make progress. And instead, what do we do in schools usually? Okay, you call the counselor, you call the vice principal, and then you get this third party intervening who doesn't know the kid or the parents at all. And they're often kind of nasty about it. And it becomes really bureaucratic, really fast. And, maybe if they support the school, they smack Johnny or something, which might or might not be a positive way to handle it. I certainly got smacked a few times as a kid. Or maybe they just say, Johnny, you're right, the school's awful, but either way, it's less likely to work as well as if you build a personal relationship with these folks. Now, when I would say things like this to people in schools, to, superintendents, principals, school board members, they would look at me as if I was from Mars, right? It's totally not how we view things. We view things in a very bureaucratic way. Oh, there's a problem. You get the vice principal in charge, discipline involved, you get the counselor involved, you get the social worker involved. You get these third parties involved. Guess what? The counselor, the social worker, the vice principal, they might have 150 kids they're dealing with or more. They're often really great people, but they're unlikely to be able to have the kind of personal touch that a teacher can have. We really need to build strong relationships between teachers and kids if we want this thing to work. We need to make schools less bureaucratic and not more. And again, I think that's why charter schools actually do pretty well with white kids, with middle-class white kids. They oftentimes don't do as well with lower-class white kids, with African-American kids, with Hispanic kids. They don't do as well with other groups. You need to build a stronger relationship with those families. And a lot of times the families didn't have good schooling experiences, kind of like my family, actually. So we need to think out of the box. And the people running for school board, the people running the systems, love the systems as they are. They just love them. And so in their view, the problem isn't with the system. The problem was with the kids. And I just argue that's not a healthy way to approach this. We got to approach it like, okay, the system's good. It's not a bad system. It's not a horrible system. It works for a lot of people. But it doesn't work for 45% of our kids. How can we change the system in ways that'll work for those 45% while still keeping the things that keep the system strong? People who go into education, they're not geeks, right? So what's the big thing that policymakers Barack Obama was into this. George W. Bush was into this. Bill Clinton was into this. They all said, we need schools to do a better job academically. Okay, the people who go into education 40 years ago, 50 years ago, were really brilliant, women and African Americans. They were amazing. My mother-in-law was a teacher back in the 60s and 70s. My sister-in-law, African American woman, my family's mostly white, but she's African American. Her mom was a teacher, right? So guess what? She did not go into teaching. She majored in finance and went into banking and made a ton of money, right? So back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 70s a little bit, we got amazing people going into teaching, women and African Americans, honestly, because of bigotry. They weren't allowed to do other things, right? So they went into teaching. So I don't have the numbers at my fingertips for African Americans, but I know for women back in 1970, about a quarter of the highest IQ women went into teaching. Now it's about a tenth. African Americans has been a similar kind of change. I've had a couple great African American teachers back in the 70s. Mr. Sproul, he was my homeroom teacher. Miss Woodson was great. I'm sure they probably have children, and I would bet their children are not in teaching, right? Their children are in banking or in government or in whatever, right? They've got other opportunities now. And that's good. I'm glad that we're not as racist as society. Black folks and women can do other things. The problem with it is we've never restructured education to get more of those really sharp people into it. And there's two reasons why we need them, I think. One is to think in out-of-the-box ways, to think in ways like, how do we close achievement gaps, right? To be those innovators, like your boss, like Kathaleena Monds says. Second reason we need them is to challenge kids at all levels. So a lot of times, we're in a college town, a lot of times the kids will know more than the teachers will. And there's even kind of a game sometimes where the teachers will figure out who the kid in the class is who knows math best, and they'll get that kid to teach the class. It's crazy stuff like that. When I talk to principals, they'll tell me things like, and I say, when I was a school board, I would follow who we hired. I remember at least once having a confrontation with a principal, good principal in a lot of ways, won a Principal of the Year award years back. And I said, okay, you realize you hired these two teachers who don't know math to teach math. And I happen to know that one of the best math teachers in the region applied for that job. Why the hell did you hire those guys? And in one case, it was a coach, I get it. In the other case, he was like, well, Bob, math, the kids can download it. And I was like, my response was, okay, would you hire an offensive line coach for the football team who did not know how to protect the quarterback from a blitz? And he said, well, no, Bob, I wouldn't do that. And I said, well, why not? The kids can download it, right? I said, the difference is it's important, right? If something is important, we hire people who know that thing and who are enthused about that thing. Football and basketball are important, and I don't question that. Math is important too. History is important. English, all these other topics are also important. We need more people who are really into subject matter going into schooling. If we want to raise the bar on schooling, especially in secondary, elementary, you can standardize the curriculum. But secondary, you need a lot of these brainiacs going into it. And yeah, the brainiacs, I will freely grant that not every brainiac is going to be a good teacher, and you have to teach them how to relate to kids who aren't into math. Actually, I remember I was an education major for about 20 minutes. And I went in and saw the education advisor, and he explained the requirements to me. This was back in the 70s, actually. Same thing happened to two friends of mine, and they went to law school as a result. And he said, okay, here's how you be a high school social studies teacher. And I said, wait, I'm not taking any courses in history or government or economics. I mean, how can I teach this field if I don't know it? And he said, oh, Bob, you don't need to know it. The curriculum people will tell you what to teach. He said, it's kind of better if you don't know it, because if you have a good knowledge of it, and if you're enthused about it, you won't be able to relate to the kids who aren't enthused about it.
Wow.
And I said, crazy, that can't work. We would never hire football coaches that way. We wouldn't say, oh, you don't care about football? Yeah, we'll hire you as the coach. It doesn't work. You need people who are enthused with the subject and into it. Now, sure, they've got to learn to reach kids who aren't naturally enthused about it. I totally get that. And not all brainiacs are good at that. There are people who will make good college professors who you would never want to put in a ninth grade classroom. Sure, use common sense about it, right? But we want people who have enthusiasm of subject matter if they're going to succeed. And that's more how they do it in Europe and Japan and Canada and other places generally do a little better than we do on these things. And that's especially important for poor kids and for kids who don't have much education in the family. And here's why. I mean, my wife and I have PhDs, right? If you're going to teach something at school, okay, my daughter's going to be bored. She'll be annoyed. My son will be bored. He'll be annoyed. But, we'll teach it to them at home, or we'll say, okay, here's the Khan Academy lecture or whatever. My kids at some point probably will be sort of okay, right? But for families without that kind of education, they're dependent on getting that knowledge from schools. If schools aren't giving them that knowledge, they're probably not going to get it. And so, we think that, having teachers who don't know subject matter, that's somehow egalitarian. No, it isn't. It's way more elitist. You're kind of assuring that well-educated families will pass that on to their kids, but less educated families just won't have a chance because their kids won't be able to get it in school. I was bored out of my mind most years in school. And then my junior year, I actually had a couple good teachers my junior year, and one of them told me about AP classes. I had never heard of AP classes before. And she talked me into taking AP English. It was my best experience in high school by far. And I was like, why did I not hear about that? That's crazy. Well, my parents never heard about it, right? It wasn't something most people talked about. My guidance counselor didn't know me and didn't really care about me, right? So just by chance, I took an AP class and it was great. And I also was like, oh, wow, I can do college work. This was like a college level class and I did really well. And that was kind of a revelation to me. We need teachers who are into subject matter to spot those kids who have that potential, because upper class parents, they'll advocate for their kids. They'll make sure their kids are getting it, or they'll get it for them at home. Middle, lower class kids, not so much at all. And so I'm going on and on, but it's kind of, school boards don't appreciate this. School administrators don't appreciate it as well, which isn't to say they're not great people. They are. One more kind of funny story about this. It's like I'm my first year on school board and we had an interim superintendent, good guy. He taught me for years, actually, before he became interim superintendent, and did it really as a public service because the district was in a bind. And I was talking to him, and we had a very good relationship. We disagreed about all kinds of things. We had a good relationship. We would listen to each other. And I say he taught me a lot. And he told me one time, Bob, your kids aren't really part of the system. I was like, well, what do you mean? I said, my kids are in the system. They go to public schools. And he said, Bob, I never see much football games. And pretty much all they take is AP classes. I was like, Paul, you're right? But guess what? We're a college town. You have to serve all kinds of people. And, my kind of people, that's 15% of this town. You got to be serving them. And so, and I'm not saying don't serve the people who want kind of an average education and spend a lot of time on football games and dances. That's fine. But you got to serve my part of town too. And he said, yeah, you're right. And there were actually some moves to WEAP program, which I was able to head off because people realized, like, hey, that's an important constituency too, and we got to serve it. But we're a college town. Most towns don't have much of an AP program. And I think that's a real problem. And where they do, a lot of times they're not doing a good job informing all kinds of kids about it. Same with gifted and talented. I think that's something we ought to do. And people say GT is racist. I actually don't think it is. I think it's mostly not racist. But I think that one thing that would make it less racist would be universal screening. And my colleague Jonathan Way has done some research on this. So right now, you get tested for gifted and talented basically the teacher asks for it in most districts. And a lot of times the teacher will ask for it because the parent asks for it. And if you have parents like mine, my parents never heard of that stuff, right? Like, what's that? And so one thing a lot of districts can do, I think, is just do universal screening, test all the kids, and then you kind of see who probably should be in GT and who probably shouldn't be. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% equal, right? I went to the honors program at the University of Maryland as a college student. At the time, it was half Jewish, and the state was maybe 3% Jewish, right? Academic achievement is not always 100% equal, especially at the secondary level. More so at the elementary level, but less at the secondary level. I always argue if we close achievement gaps in elementary school, over the long term, we're going to close those gaps in secondary and high school, but you got to start with elementary. But the fact is there's an awful lot of kids, of students of color, of kids, low-income kids, kids like the hillbilly elegy guy with multiple dads in the home, that it's not going to occur to the teacher to test them. But if we test them, we'll find out that, yeah, they probably belong in gifted and talented. Universal testing is something we can do that would maintain, and I think can really enhance academic quality, but also be more equal. It would make sure that quality is more equal, that more kids have more opportunities. Here's something else, and I have to say, ESSA, I thought I was going to be like a super school board member, right? I introduced a resolution for us to do this. And then our director of accountability whispered in my ear and said, well, Bob, we already have to do that because the SSA requires it. And I said, oh, okay. I withdraw the resolution. To do it. So here's something people don't realize, right? We have all these programs to give more money to low-income schools. And more money is funneled to low-income school districts. Okay, it goes to the district level. Once it goes to the district level, districts tend to reapportion it in ways that help their richer schools because that's where the parents are more active, right? And so the inequalities within districts dwarf those between districts, especially since here's another thing, almost any union contract, and where there's not union contracts, just civil service rules, tend to say that senior teachers get to pick their assignments. There's a certain rationale to that, right? You want to reward loyalty. But what it means is our senior teachers tend to go to the wealthier areas, and very few of them are in the high poverty areas. And that can be a real problem. School districts need more ability to pay teachers more to go to the tougher places. And one way to at least shine a spotlight on that is we should be reporting, and thanks to ESSA, we do report it. We shouldn't be reporting spending on the school district level. I mean, we should, but we also should be reporting school level on the school level, because what you'll tend to find is schools in the poorer parts of town, despite Title I and all these other things we do for equality, schools in the poorer parts of town tend to spend less per child. The reason why is the big expenses are for teacher salaries. And the teachers that are more senior, that make more money because of seniority rules, tend to congregate in the richer parts of town. So you might have a case where, and I actually have not seen the numbers recently, but I would guess the richest school in my district, the school that is about 10% free and reduced lunch, I would guess spends about twice, the richest elementary, I would guess spends about 50% more per pupil than the most low-income school in my district. That's about 60%, 65% free and reduced lunch, simply because the more senior teachers gravitate towards the wealthier schools, and those teachers get paid more. We need to shine a light on those inequities, and I think start having discussions about how to make them less unequal, how to increase teacher pay on the poor side of town, basically. Those are hard discussions to have, and I'm not necessarily optimistic about any quick resolutions of them, but the first step is to at least talk about it. But I'm going on and on about school boards and equity and how to do education better and all kinds of things. But I'm kind of, stuff you want to talk about, stuff I'm not covering as well.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you said that because, in this conversation, we were talking about school boards, but you hit on so many different key aspects on how to serve all kids and looping and making those relationships between teachers and parents, and also just universal screening with gifted and talented kids, and just to make sure that we understand that we are teaching, as teachers, teaching the whole child and giving the students an opportunity to show their talent so they're not just bored in class like you were. So, you're touching a lot of different things, prioritizing academics over athletics, which is what we see a lot in public schools. And you also mentioned how, we can take some of the things that you've probably seen in charter schools and apply it to, the school districts in the public schools area. So we've definitely hit on a lot. I believe that you added a lot of value to this conversation about, school boards and just a lot of things that our listeners probably have not known and things that I surely did not know, having that background and having that history being a part of the school boards. And so I just want to say thank you for everything that you have said.
I really do. Let me have one more thing I meant to say.
Okay.
This is just kind of funny, right? So check any school board you have, right? Ask if they have kids or grandkids, at least, in the local public schools. And I've never done this study, so I have no idea what the answer would be. My guess is about half do. No, they generally didn't go to private schools or charter schools, but a lot of them they've aged out, right? Their kids are older. They don't necessarily have kids in the system. So, but there's also a problem. Our school board training is for us to be hands-off. Something that was really emphasized to me and everybody else, the school board training is the chain of command. So if a parent comes to you with a question or problem, you're supposed to send it to the principal. What if the principal is the problem, which is sometimes the case, right? We all know in the real world, that's sometimes how it works. So the thing that I always preach to school boards, and even with my own board, I never really succeeded at it, is do surveys, do anonymous surveys of your parents. And The year before I was on school board, we had this wild and crazy director of accountability. She was great. I know her very well, actually. And she did a survey of all of her parents and a separate one of all of her teachers. It was not shared with school board members, but I was able to get a bootleg copy. And I read it, and it was fascinating. My district has 16 schools, right? And I kind of understand the 3 schools that my kids are attending now or have recently attended. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of them. I have almost no understanding of the other 13 schools, right? And I think any board member who's honest will tell you that's kind of how it is. So I found out all these fascinating things about leadership. And so the next year we had a reform superintendent, and the reform superintendent pretty quickly basically fired or reassigned 5 of our principals. And I immediately could see why. And I could say, yeah, you've made the right decisions on this. And, here's 2 more you might want to think about. And he said, yeah, I'm thinking about them, right? But I and other board members would have had no idea because, regular people aren't going to approach you. They're going to be kind of afraid of you. And unless your kids are in that school, you're not going to really understand what's going on. So I'm a huge believer in try to do some entity to do survey work. I mean, don't put it on the front page of the papers. I get that. Don't air your dirty laundry in public. But unless you know what parents and teachers really think of their leadership anonymously, you're not really going to know. I mean, the worst principals and the worst vice principals are the people who, pardon the expression, constantly suck up to school board members and superintendents. And you think, oh, so-and-so, they're amazing, right? They might well be treating kids and teachers terribly. And you would have no idea of it. You have to do those surveys. You have to get a sense of it. On the flip side, we've had people, I know vice principal very well, one of the best people in the system. Higher ups don't necessarily like him. He's going to come out and tell you, he's like, I think you guys are making a mistake on this, and here's why. No, he won't say it publicly. He won't attack us in the press. But privately, he'll come and say, here's why this might not work. He's not a super popular guy necessarily in administration, but he's a good vice principal, right? Unless we have those things like survey research, school board members and higher admin often literally don't know what's going on. And we need to have better systems in place. So if they're a mind to, they can figure it out. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on, but it's kind of fun stuff that school systems just don't do. We just don't do much of this stuff.
Yes, and you're talking about so much, so many good trends and so many good things that school systems can change, or how school boards can be an influence to help the change in education. And I guess I would just ask you this last question. What has your history with being, a part of the school board and just really knowing more about that other side of education, how has that shaped your overall view of education?
I mean, it's both more positive and more negative. It's more positive in that we have so many people that maybe even though their goals aren't exactly the same as mine, they are very good people who are working very hard to keep systems running and who really believe in the system. And for them, the system played a huge part in their lives. Maybe schools didn't serve me very well, but there are so many people on school boards and in school administration and so many teachers. The system served them very well. And I think we who are education reformers need to appreciate their voices and need to see where they're coming from. At the same time, I think that and we reformers need to get involved in the system and try to change it from within. At the same time, I think these people, for all their strengths, they're probably just not, because they love the system so much, they're probably not able to see its flaws, and they're probably not able to change it in ways that are really going to serve, in particular, low-income kids, in particular the kids that have multiple dads and things like that. And so I think we have to work within the system, but I just think we also really need more choices for kids that, for whatever reason, just aren't thriving in the existing systems. I think the existing systems give them all the money in the world, but they're just not going to change because people in the systems, they're good people. They're really good people and they're very hardworking people, but the system served them. And so they can't understand the people who the system isn't serving. They have trouble putting themselves in the shoes of those people. And so I think we just need to create more alternatives for the kids who aren't thriving in the existing systems. Now, are all those alternatives going to be amazing? No, a lot of them we're going to have to shut down. A lot of them we do shut down. but I think that they do provide chances. Like I say, charter schools, take your average kid, he or she's probably going to do kind of okay in the traditional public schools. Charter schools and private schools tend to be very valuable for the kids who are a couple years ahead or a couple years behind, the kids who need something different academically and a lot of times emotionally too. They need a system where instead of getting a new teacher every year, they need a couple of grown-ups who are stable, who are in their lives for 3 or 4 or 5 years at a time and who really care about them and look after them and will go the extra 9 yards to make them work. And the traditional system we set up, for all its strengths, is very bureaucratic. It's not set up to do those kinds of relationships. It's set up where you get imagine if you're in a job and you get a new boss every year, or secondary education, you have 7 bosses and you get 7 new bosses every year, right? It's not realistic to expect all of our kids to thrive in those environments. But the people running the system just, to me, don't seem capable of changing those environments. So we've got to create new ones and have those alternatives, which with Kathaleena Monds and other people, at your center and elsewhere are working on doing. And the final thing I'll say on that is it's not going to be quick, right? It's going to be a 20 or 30 or 40 year thing to do that. My first academic work was in civil service reform. And I argue it really took about 40 years, 50 years to set up the civil service system. And then people like Al Gore and Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan in the 80s and 90s were trying to reform that system and make it better. And that too is an ongoing process. It's going to take 40 years I think, for us to get a really better system. Things happen slowly, but it doesn't mean they're not worth happening. And you got to, always keep in mind the kids that we're not serving as well as we need to serve.
Wow, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for coming on to the EdYOUcate podcast. Thank you for all of the knowledge and the wisdom that you have been giving to me as well as the listeners. You have just completed the most recent episode of the EdYOUcate podcast. Thank you for listening to the most fired up educational podcast out. Tune in every first Wednesday of each month at 5 p.m. during the 2021 through 2022